regardless of what you believe in, everybody should watch this interview because this man right here just proved that God exists on live television. And this goes hand in hand with what I've been studying recently. I read a book. I mentioned this before. I read a book, just finished it like last week, called Expository Apologetics by Vadi. And it teaches us how to be very clear on what we believe as Christians and also how to communicate that properly. But that's obviously from the standpoint of using scripture in order to support our belief systems, as opposed to just like sheerly depending and relying on our personal experience, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with your personal experience. There's nothing wrong with your personal testimony. But sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, you got to actually go to the Bible and break down the Bible and explain to people why they should put their trust in faith in Jesus Christ using the scripture. And that's why I love the book Expository Apologetics. Now, this is on the other side of it. This explores the scientific argument for God, because a lot of people, they'll say, okay, well, how do you get over the theory of Darwinism? How do you get over the Big Bang? What's your response to this is all just a simulation? You know, this is all just one, giant game that we're playing in. How do you handle those objections? And I think this is a great video because this is Stephen Meyer. He's a scientist and he takes the scientific approach as opposed to using the scriptures and using his personal experience. So overall, I think it just gives us more of a well-rounded understanding of how to defend the faith that we so firmly believe in. All right. So like I said, regardless of what you believe in, this is an incredible video. So the very first thing they're going to tackle is the theory of Darwinism. I had to fast forward the clip because there was a Joe Rogan clip. So I skipped over that just so I don't have any issues with like licensing and whatnot. But he's going to break down the theory of Darwinism and essentially why it's not true. All right. So let's get into it. And then he's going to go into a whole other argument proving that God exists, debunking all the most common scientific arguments. All right, let's go. This is from the Piers Morgan Uncensored show. All right. I feel like I keep saying all right a lot. I've had a lot of these espressos. I've had a lot of cappuccinos. All right. I need to chill. Let's go.
Response.
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but
probably not as qualified as you. But he likes to.
It started something that happened here in London a few years ago, 2016. A major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And many of the conveners are calling for a new theory because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the NeoDarwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major changes in the history of life.
And is the crux of this debate, is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler, non-living chemicals? That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest, Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today. But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there in the fossil record, we do see very abrupt, many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life.
So is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. There's the small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power. And I think at this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host.
That was a powerful statement. He said, the degree to which it has genuine creative power.
And he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, many of them surrounding this problem of the mechanism lacks the generative or creative power necessary to account for the major innovations in the history of life.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are 3 big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God?
Well, right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What, in fact, the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God, yes.
Okay, so let's play a clip from Dawkins on this show. So why is it not not that there is a superior being, power, which many people believe in different ways?
It's possible there are
different
fairies
types
at the bottom of the garden. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. you can't deny that.
Well, except I've never seen fairies in the garden. Have you?
No, you've never seen God either.
No, but you don't know for sure that either doesn't exist.
No, I don't know that fairies don't exist. Fairies may be leprechauns, for all I know.
You know, my big question for all atheists, is, okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have.
There's a lot of pride in atheism. Like, can you really sit here and genuinely say to yourself that all of this that you see around us was as a result of some big explosion that just magically and creatively is responsible for all of this goodness and beauty that we see? Like, you can see the goodness of God if you just open up your eyes and just look around, just walk outside. I don't even care where you are. You might be, so I live in California, so I'm not trying to hate on anybody else where y'all live, but you know what I'm saying? When I walk outside, like, bruh, I see it. It's beautiful. You could live anywhere. Ohio, not trying to, not to hate on, Ohio, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you could still walk out. You might not have the same, palm trees and stuff like that, but you could look around and you're like, wow, this is beautiful. Creation is beautiful. You could see it. You got to be a fool to say in your heart that God is not real. That's what the Bible says. Because you know, as well as I know, that this creative beauty that we are blessed to be able to experience on a daily basis was not a result of some massive explosion. All right, let's get back to it.
Because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case, and that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
Oh, the single cell as opposed to the universe.
Well, I guess you go back to the universe,
Yeah,
and then you go back to the creation of a single cell that has this incredible complexity that eventually, through the process of evolution, leads to human beings.
Yeah, I do think
do you believe that's really the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell, in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. And
Brilliant phrase.
Wonderful. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell.
You know what I like about him? And this is my first time watching any content and, consuming any ideas from Stephen Meyer. But I like how he handles individuals who he disagrees with. He does it in a very eloquent and respectful manner that I really appreciate.
We have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing, and that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
But do you believe, like I said, originally there's just...
So he said, in a single cell, all of that exists. So you have all of that systematically at work, perfectly inside of a single cell. And thanks to, modern technology, we now know how complex a single cell is. It's almost like a computer program is running within a single cell. But listen to what he says next about it.
One single solitary cell that's created.
Well, right. Presumably, that's where...
Is that what you think?
I do think there was an original cell that was created.
Because the theory of evolution says the journey from single cell to the full complexity of life on Earth and so on happened by random trial and error. But your position, I think, is that it's so complicated, this original single cell, so complex for all the reasons you just articulated, that that's just simply not feasible, that it would be just random trial and error. It had to be the creation of some superior entity.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, again, there's two contexts. There's how do you get to the first cell, and then how do you get from the first cell to everything else. Let's just take the origin of the first cell.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
Right. Here's the evidence, though, that when we see information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, and this is what we actually see in the DNA, when Francis Crick elucidated what he called the sequence hypothesis in the late 1950s, he realized that the 4 subunits along the interior of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of software. What we know from experience is that whenever we say information of that sort, it always comes from a mind. Bill Gates, our local hero, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that it functions like a machine code. Well, what we know is that software comes from a programmer. And in fact, whenever we see information of that kind, whether it's in a software program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, it always arises from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life and even the simplest living cell, I argue, is decisive evidence of the activity of a designing mind in the origin of life.
Oh my goodness gracious. Just rewind that if you need to and just listen to what he said, bro. The fact that in a single cell, it operates like a software program. And we recognize today, look, we see, computer programs, software programs, we see all this technology, and we understand that technology did not create itself, but yet it had a programmer. But then when it comes to the existence of everything, suddenly we think, oh, it just created itself. I don't get it. I mean, I get it. It's like, okay, yeah, that's a comfortable, flesh-pleasing argument, because if there's no God, then there's nobody for you to submit to. There's nobody for you to be disciplined towards. You can live however you see fit according to your own understanding, as opposed to the eternal understanding of the one who created everything. So I get why people don't want to believe in God, because naturally that rebellious spirit is taking over. But I don't see how, when you really sit down and study things, how everything that you believe in terms of your unbelief doesn't just crumble to the ground.
What is the Goldilock Zone? Another of your big bedrocks of your book.
Well, this is one way that the physicists refer to something that they call the fine-tuning of the universe, or sometimes they talk about it, the anthropic fine-tuning. The idea is that the most fundamental parameters of physics fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances, outside of which we have discovered life would not be possible. Even basic chemistry would not be possible. So the force responsible for the expansion of the universe, called the cosmological constant, is fine-tuned. An accepted value is to 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. So a smidge faster or slower in that expansion, and you either get a heat death of the universe or you get a big crunch, a great black hole. In either case, life is not possible. And that's just one of many parameters that fall within that kind of a sweet spot. So sometimes the physicists do talk about are living in a Goldilocks universe. Luke Barnes has written a wonderful book about the fine-tuning. A physicist who also did his PhD at Cambridge has written a book called The Fortunate Universe. So these types of terms are now making their way into physics, because physicists did not expect that life would depend upon such an exquisitely and improbably arranged set of basic parameters. But there we have it. They did. This is what they found.
But again, that comes back to the idea of a designer of all this.
Well, one of the scientists who first discovered these fine-tuning parameters was Fred Hoyle. And Hoyle was a pretty aggressive scientific atheist. He opposed the Big Bang and even gave the Big Bang its name, the Big Bang, as a kind of pejorative to make fun of the concept. But after he discovered some of these fine-tuning parameters, he had a shift in his philosophical perspective, in his worldview. And he was later quoted as saying that a common sense interpretation of the data, the fine-tuning data, suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. And I would say I love the way the monkeys always make it into the origins discussion, even if it's in physics.
Always goes back to monkeys.
Always monkeys, either at a typewriter or something. Yeah.
There are other scientific hypotheses that don't use God as an explanation for all this. One is the simulation matrix theory, which Elon Musk talks about, or the idea of a multiverse. And when I had Neil deGrasse Tyson on, the astrophysicist, he said this: what was there before the beginning of the universe? Everyone asks this question. What's the simple answer?
Oh, I'm delighted I can respond to you. We don't know. But we got top people working on it. Okay.
You know what?
There may have been a multiverse.
I like that. I like the honesty. So we genuinely don't know. People just don't know, right?
We don't know. There might have been a multiverse that's birthing universes, and we're one of them. But that just pushes the question one step further before that. What was around before the multiverse? So we just don't know. It's a.
You know what would be crazy? If Neil deGrasse Tyson came to Jesus Christ and gave his life to Jesus and became a Christian, could you imagine this man using all that brain power that he has? Because I know he's smart, obviously. But if he can shift that to Christ and use that for Christ, oh my goodness. I could just imagine him so on fire for God, like it would be wild. And I think a lot of people would be like, yo, the arguments that you are making are hard to disagree with. I'm praying that happens, because at a certain point, I just feel like at a certain point, when you are that smart and when you have this much knowledge of science at that level, it has to lead you to God. How could it not? But then you have these people who want to make up, oh, it could have been a multiverse. Have you seen Spider-Man into the multiverse? You think that that's what we living in? Is multiple universes? So what are we really doing then? What is the meaning of all of this then? If there's just multiple versions of this to the infinite degree.
Frontier question right now.
What is your response? I mean, a lot of astrophysicists and Elon Musk and others think it's actually about the multiverse. For those who don't know, what is the multiverse? And what's your response to that?
Sure. The multiverse is the idea that, yes, the universe is incredibly finely tuned against all odds to make life possible. But the explanation for that is not that there was a cosmic fine-tuner, an intelligence who set the universe up so that life would be possible, but rather that there's a billion or gabillions of other universes out there that have different combinations of these different settings of these different parameters, and that ours just happens to be the lucky one. And the reason that we have life in our universe is not that it was designed for life, but rather there was a kind of giant cosmic lottery that is responsible, and that life must have arisen somewhere. And again, we just happen to be in the lucky universe. And my response.
Yes.
Yes, right. Well, the multiverse hypothesis is specifically relevant to explaining this fine-tuning. But there's a problem with it, and that is that if you have all these other universes out there, the very existence of these other universes does not explain the fine-tuning in our universe. And here's why. If those other universes are separate from our own, then there's no causal connection between them. So whatever happens in those other universes has no effect on our universe, including it has no effect on whatever process was responsible for setting the fine-tuning. So in virtue of that, multiverse proponents have had to propose a kind of common cause of all the universes, a universe-generating machine of some kind that could allow them to portray our universe as the lucky winner of a giant cosmic lottery. And that's where the rub comes in.
But is that possible?
Well, yeah, there's a problem with it. And that is that all of the different universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed, some based on something called string theory, others based on something called inflationary cosmology, themselves require prior fine-tuning in the universe-generating mechanisms. And so you explain the fine-tuning in this universe by invoking a universe-generating mechanism, but that mechanism in turn has to be finely tuned, and so you're right back to where you started without an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning. And yet we know from our experience that when we find something that's finely tuned, think of a French recipe or an internal combustion engine or a radio dial, fine-tuning always requires, in our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, it always requires a fine-tuner, an intelligence. So given that the multiverse hasn't given an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning, the best explanation for fine-tuning is still intelligent design.
You obviously have a gigantic brain, that's clear, and you obviously know all about this
Oh
stuff.
my gosh.
But are you prepared to accept you could just be completely wrong about this?
Oh, of course, science is inherently
What would
provisional.
you, if you could ask Neil deGrasse Tyson this, but if you could get the answer to any of life's great mysteries, if I said to you, come on, the two or three things you'd most like to know the answer to, that no one's ever worked out, what would they be?
I think it's well, I just lost my mother. And I think the deepest and hardest questions in life are not actually these big metaphysical questions. I think if you think carefully about them, there's a pretty clear answer. But I think it's the questions that come up because of the events in your own life, and sometimes suffering, sometimes joys, why things went this way rather than that way. Those are the questions I think are the hardest ones, the existential questions of one's own personal experience.
I'm very sorry about your mother.
I shouldn't have introduced a personal element like that. But
I'm glad you did, because actually it does play into what you just said. Did that whole experience of losing your mother, did it change any of your thinking about any of this?
I think the experience of grief was something that was unexpected in how intense it was. She had dementia and had been in decline for several years. You think you're prepared when you're losing someone by degrees, but there's a finality of death that I think overtakes all of us in that moment of grief. And there's something about the grief experience that...
Wow. He said you think you're prepared when you're losing somebody by degrees. That was a profound. That was a profound statement, because you're expecting it. You see that person, and you see their health disintegrating. Step by step, degree by degree. So ultimately, you know that it's coming. You know that this is the season that person is in their life, and so you think that you're prepared for it, but ultimately, you're not as prepared as you thought you were. That was super interesting how he said that.
Seems to make everything else pale to insignificance in that moment. And I think it's kind of, my own view of it is kind of a signal. Like your conscience tells you what's right and wrong, I think grief is telling you about what's really important. And that in that instance, what was important is that we had lost a person of eternal value. And so, I think it was, you're never really prepared for the loss of a parent. And I thought I was, but I wasn't.
Do you take comfort because of your religious conviction that you'll see your mother again in an afterlife?
I absolutely do, yeah. And I think when I was on the Rogan program, it was probing about both the objective evidence for belief in God and my subjective experience. And I would never base an argument to another scientist or philosopher on my subjective experience. But I think belief in God has, I think, legitimate objective and subjective basis. And I think that mysterious moment when you see a loved one passing, when the body is there, but the person is gone, it raises some profound metaphysical questions, or maybe a metaphysical awareness that there is something more than the material that is part of all of us.
So in a way, what you went through with your mother may have actually intensified your own belief in your theory about all this.
Yeah, sure.
Because you felt it.
Yeah, exactly.
You see, that's where whenever I argue with atheists, I'm always struck by their refusal to go there into stuff like that. And yet they must themselves, through their own life experiences, have moments and experiences which must test their own conviction that there is nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a both-and thing if you're a believer. There's plenty of good, solid scientific evidence, good philosophical reasons for belief, but then there are these experiences too that we have along the way that suggest it's not just matter in motion. There's more to the world than the material stuff.
When you hear someone like Richard Dawkins, when he's so emphatic that he's right, and believing in gods like believing in fairies and all this kind of thing, do you respect that, or do you think it's just performative?
Well, I honestly, he signed a book for me once in a line. I've never met him. But when I watched the interview you did with him, and I honestly, there's something about the guy. I love the guy. He's so intense about.
He was quite rude about me.
This is what I'm saying about how he handles people who he disagrees with. I think he handles it with so much grace and so much enthusiasm, but it's not like compromising anything that he himself believes, which I think is beautiful.
I don't know why, because I really quite enjoyed the interview. And I thought it was quite like,
it looked like you were having fun.
Yeah, I didn't think it was a problem. He clearly thought there was. But
I always feel that anyone who has that level of intensity about the big questions in life is someone with whom I share a kindred spirit. Now we've come to the opposite conclusion, but I also think he has this great talent for framing issues. The universe we observe has exactly the properties we should expect. That's a great quote. If no design, no purpose. Another one, he says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And yet, Dawkins himself acknowledges that he can't explain the origin of the first life.
Right.
So,
and that to me, right there, his inability to do that is where his whole position to me collapses. Because if you're going to just make assumptions that another person's view is completely wrong, there cannot be a God. Well, okay, fine, but you've got to be able to explain.
You got to deliver the goods.
Yes.
In the interview with you, it was so telling. When you asked him what he wished he knew, and could explain, he said the origin of the universe. The origin of life, and the nature of consciousness.
Yeah.
Well, those are the very things that materialism is. Not just that science can't explain those, a materialistic worldview fails to explain those.
Yes, and actually a belief in God is, in a way, endorsed by those big questions, because the human brain cannot come up with any other logical explanation. So a logical explanation based on science and data, it doesn't exist.
And this is not God of the gaps. Okay, there are gaps there for materialism, but the materialists assume that any explanation that doesn't involve a purely material process is an explanation that is just filling a mere gap. But the rules of explanation are a little different than that. A good explanation provides a causally adequate explanation, where you infer an entity which, if true, would be capable of generating and therefore explaining the thing of interest. We look at the origin of the universe, and we understand that matter, space, time, and energy come into existence. Then prior to that, there's no matter again to do the causing. So materialistic explanations are inherently inadequate, and yet positing an external entity that has volition and agency does fit the bill. If true, that would provide a positive explanation.
So here's a tough question.
Universe.
Because I've had family members who've renounced their faith over the Holocaust, for example. Right? How could a fair, just God allow that to happen? When you look at what's happened in Israel and then Gaza in the last 6 months, a lot of people might question, well, why would a God that has the universal creative superpower of the kind that you believe God had to create all this, why would they allow such misery and hell to also exist
tragic
in this
messes
life?
of the kind you just
Have you thought about
that? Well, of course. There's a traditional theistic answer, goes back to St. Augustine and maybe earlier, the idea of it's sometimes called the free will defense if you're in an argument about the so-called problem of evil. I actually find it persuasive and compelling. And it's the idea that God created us as free moral agents, and understood in creating us that way that he was taking a risk. That we could use our agency for good or for ill. We could use it to love him and to love the other creatures he's made, or we could use it to aggrandize ourselves. And we have instances of both on this planet. And the people say, well, why would God do that? Well, I think the answer is that God understood that creating agents with free will opened the possibility of evil, but it also opened the possibility of genuine love.
Wow.
If he had created mere robots, we wouldn't really be persons. We wouldn't have the quality of life that is possible to us. So it's, in a sense,
This is, and he just said something that I have been trying to articulate for a very long time on this channel. It's like some people just want God to enslave us to the point where we can't make any other decision except to follow him, except to serve him. Is that genuine and true love and affection? No, it's not. It's slavery. But that's what some people expect God to do. Just like he said, if that were the case, the door cannot be open for genuine love. Because God could very easily just be like, he could very easily just snap his finger and everybody just bow down and worship him and follow him from that point on. That is very simple and easy, and it probably would be even quicker than just snapping his finger. He could probably just, it's just a thought, and it's like, boom, everyone just falls down in his worship. That's very simple. But genuine love, how do you create genuine love? It has to be something that comes from a result of our own free will. Otherwise, that's slavery. I don't know. Go back and listen to how he articulated that, because that was beautiful.
Evidence of a divine risk, but it was a risk that I think he deemed worth taking. And ultimately, in the Christian tradition, which you and I share, there's a plan for sorting all that out at the end. Redemption.
Do you believe in aliens?
Well, I'm very skeptical about extraterrestrial intelligence. It used to be...
Isn't it more likely than not that there are aliens?
That's a very good question, Piers. It used to be thought among physicists and astrophysicists that the answer to that question was yes, because there's so many galaxies. And this is part of the cosmological question that's so fascinating. I wrote in Return of the God Hypothesis that there were 200 billion galaxies. I've since been corrected by an astrophysics colleague who says it's probably closer to 2 trillion now.
Which is an insane number.
An insane number of galaxies.
So how can we say with any real conviction that we're the only things like this?
There's a couple of books that came out in the early 2000s. One called Rare Earth by 2 astronomers at the University of Washington, another called Privileged Planet. And yes, there's a lot of galaxies out there, but it turns out that the number of parameters that have to be finely tuned in a just right way to make not just a universe conducive or consistent with life, but a life-friendly solar system, a life-friendly planet, the number and improbability of getting all of those parameters right may actually dwarf the number of galaxies and planets out there. It's an open question. But it used to be thought a slam dunk, there must be life elsewhere. Now I think there's an argument both ways among the astrophysicists.
But the truth is nobody knows.
Nobody knows. We haven't found anything like it.
Final question. What's the meaning of life?
Well, I think it ultimately is to come into a relationship with the creator who made the universe. In the closing chapter of my book, I talk about Viktor Frankl and the man's search for meaning, how universal that is. And that nothing can mean anything to a rock or to an atom or to a planet. Things only mean things to persons. So if there is to be meaning in life, there must be genuine persons to whom we can mean something and whom can mean something to us.
Wow.
And yet we all die. And so I think if there is a God, it reopens that question of ultimate meaning. The French existentialists used to say of Sartre, without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting or enduring meaning.
Right.
But if there is an infinite reference point, and that infinite reference point is personal, that is to say, if the universe was created by a personal agent who wants to know us, then the possibility of enduring meaning is again on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with Ricky Gervais. It's like, well, if you only believe that what happens in your existence here that's it, how sort of pointless, transitory, and vacuous it must all be to you. Whereas if you believe in the concept of infinite life, albeit in a different way, that's great.
That's the question that haunted me as a teenager. I used to, it was, what's it going to matter in 100 years? No matter what I worked on, no matter what I achieved, no matter what goal I set, I thought I couldn't. What was the point? And I one time came across the quote from Bertrand Russell, where he talks about all the great labors of the human race and the noonday, the brightness of human achievement. Noonday human achievement is destined for extinction in the vast death of the solar system. I wasn't much fun at parties as a teenager. But those sorts of, at a certain point in life, whether it's when you're very young or often when you're nearing the end, those sorts of questions
Particularly, I think, when you get near the end.
Yeah.
When you're really questioning, am I right? It just seems to me completely, in the same way that when atheists can't explain what happened before the Big Bang, and when they can't say that, and when they say nothing happens when you die and stuff, that's where my belief in God gets massively increased. Well, it's one of the main reasons I think there must be a God, is that actually none of that would make sense, that we just started one day and there was this weird thing called nothing before there, which no one can really explain to me what that is. And at the end of it, it just ends and then that's the end of that. That doesn't make any sense, that someone would create something so extraordinary that's led to us, the human being, and then at the end, that's it.
And that's the other thing about the grief emotion, is that it seems to be telling us there's something profoundly unnatural, not intended by death. But then on the flip side, in that realm of objective scientific evidence, and this is the message of my book, to me, when I look inside the cell and see the evidence of that digital storage, transmission, and processing system. Richard Dawkins himself said, upon seeing an animation of this recently, that he was knocked sideways with wonder at the intricacy and complexity of the digital information processing that's going on inside cells. This is extraordinary. It's like a 3D printer. You've got digital code directing the construction of three-dimensional structures and machines all inside the tiniest recesses of the cell. There is no materialistic, chemical, evolutionary, or other account of that. But we see features inside the cell that are reminiscent of our own high-tech information and digital technology. This seems to be pointing, obviously, to a transcendent mind.
Fascinating stuff. Return of the God Hypothesis. What a great book. Great to see you.
Wonderful.
Dr. Meyer, thank you.
That was a great interview. I want to see the inside of a cell. I wonder if there's an animation of the inside.
The Big Bang Theory.
Wait. Let me see. Yeah, let me see. Animation of the inside a cell. Whoa. The inner life of a cell. Wow. I mean, there's a lot of animations. Let me click on this one. The inner life of a cell. I'm just curious because I never even thought about that before he even mentioned it. So how is it that all of this is going on inside of one single cell? All of these systems purposely driven to produce an outcome could just randomly come about with an explosion. Obviously, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that there was creative design developed in this process by God. And this is an old animation. This is like from 14 years ago. So I could show a newer animation, but I think you pretty much get the point. That was a great interview from Piers Morgan Uncensored. I'll link that interview down below in the description for those of you who want to, rewatch it. I'm out, y'all.